Tom Moore never imagined that the two people he trusted most in the world, his wife Rachel and his father Richard, would be the ones to destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. When Tom uncovered their secret affair, his perfect life shattered, and the devastating betrayal set off a chain of events that would change their lives forever. At first glance, the Moore family seemed to have it all. Tom Moore, a successful businessman in his early 40s, was well respected. In his community, his wife Rachel was known for her grace and beauty, and the couple shared 2 children, a son and a daughter, who were adored by everyone. They lived in a beautiful home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood, a picture of suburban perfection. To the outside world, the Moores were a family that had it all: success, wealth, love, and a stable home. Tom had worked hard to build his business empire, and Rachel had been a supportive wife throughout it all. Their marriage, although not perfect, seemed strong. They had their ups and downs, like any couple, but nothing that suggested any kind of deep fracture. Rachel was a devoted mother, attending school events and managing the household, while Tom focused on his career. Their family was always together for holidays, birthday parties, and family outings. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. One of the pillars of the Moore family was Tom's father, Richard Moore. Richard had built his own successful career before retiring and becoming a fixture in the family's life. As a father, he was a source of advice and support, frequently visiting Tom and Rachel at their home. Over time, however, Richard's presence became more frequent. While his visits were never out of the ordinary, there was always something oddly magnetic about the way Rachel and Richard interacted with each other. No one ever thought much of it. Richard was just being a father after all. But for Rachel, something more was at play. Rachel had always been an enchanting woman. People were drawn to her warmth and beauty, and she had an uncanny ability to charm those around her. But with Tom, her marriage was starting to feel more like a routine than a partnership. As time passed, she found herself growing lonely. Tom was busy with his business, and her emotional needs were neglected. It wasn't that Tom didn't love her. It was just that his work demanded all of his attention, and Rachel, left to her own devices, began to feel isolated and unfulfilled. It was during one of Richard's routine visits that something shifted. Richard, despite his age, still had a commanding presence. His wisdom and years of experience gave him an aura of authority, and Rachel couldn't help but feel drawn to him. They began to spend more time together in private, discussing everything from family matters to Tom's business dealings. Richard, noticing Rachel's loneliness and vulnerability, began to offer more than just advice. He provided the emotional attention Rachel craved, listening to her in ways Tom never had. Their bond grew stronger. At first it was innocent enough, a conversation here, a shared drink there. But soon it crossed into dangerous territory. The flirtation that began so subtly grew into something more intense, something neither of them could ignore. Richard's visits were no longer about family matters. They were about something more secretive, more thrilling, and as their connection deepened, so did the guilt that Rachel carried with her. But the allure of Richard's attention and the escape from her lonely reality were too powerful to resist. This was the beginning of the affair, one that would soon threaten to unravel the very fabric of the Moore family's seemingly perfect life. Neither Rachel nor Richard could predict the devastating consequences that would follow. Their secret bond born out of a quiet loneliness and an unexpected connection, would set off a chain of events that would change their lives. And Tom's forever. The stage was set for a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. Tom Moore was a man who prided himself on being attentive and in tune with the details of his life. His business success had been built on his ability to notice the small things, details others might overlook, and it was this instinct that began to tell him something wasn't right. It started slowly, with subtle shifts in Rachel's behavior. She became more distant, more preoccupied, and Tom, who had always felt that he knew his wife inside and out, couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something she wasn't telling him. At first, he thought it was just the pressures of life catching up with her. She was raising their 2 children, managing the household, and keeping up appearances as the supportive wife. Maybe she was just tired, he reasoned. But as the weeks passed, her behavior became harder to ignore. She was frequently distracted, often lost in thought, her mind somewhere far away. She would absent-mindedly nod along during conversations or stare out the window, her mind seemingly elsewhere. Tom began to feel like a stranger to her, as though they were living in the same house but inhabiting separate worlds. Tom tried to dismiss his concerns, attributing her aloofness to stress. But then there were other things that began to raise alarms. He noticed that Rachel's phone was constantly buzzing, but whenever he walked into the room, she would quickly swipe it out of sight. When she left the house to run errands, she would be gone longer than expected, and Tom started to wonder where she really was. It was the little things at first, tiny inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. The way she would always make sure her phone was face down on the kitchen counter. The hurried way she would exit the house when Richard, Tom's father, would stop by for his regular visits. The awkwardness in the air when Tom and Richard shared a conversation, as if there was something unsaid between them. The unease grew. Tom began to pay closer attention to Richard, whose presence in the home had become more frequent and, to Tom's growing suspicion, more deliberate. At first he attributed it to the natural closeness of family. After all, Richard had always been involved in their lives, offering advice and support, but there was something about the way Richard and Rachel interacted now that made Tom uneasy. The casual touches, the private glances, nothing overt, nothing that could be seen as suspicious by an outsider, but enough to stir a deep discomfort in Tom. It wasn't until he stumbled upon an unexpected piece of evidence that his suspicions solidified. One evening, while Rachel was in the shower, Tom decided to check her phone. It was a decision that filled him with guilt even before he did it. But something inside him urged him to take action. What he found confirmed his worst fear. Rachel and Richard had been exchanging messages, and the contents were more than just casual conversation. The messages were filled with private jokes, flirty remarks, and veiled words that carried an undeniable intimacy. There was no mistaking it. His wife and father were having an affair. The shock that ran through Tom was like a tidal wave. He stared at the screen, his hands shaking, his mind reeling. The betrayal was not just in the affair itself, it was in the realization that it had been hidden from him for so long. The love and trust he had placed in Rachel, the relationship he had worked so hard to maintain, seemed like an illusion. But the most painful part was realizing that Richard, the man who had always been a father figure to him, was the one who had not only betrayed him, but had done so in the most intimate and devastating way possible. Tom's heart raced as the enormity of what had been happening behind his back began to sink in. His world, once secure and predictable, was now shrouded in lies. The man he had admired and trusted had not only taken advantage of his wife's vulnerability, but had done so in a way that destroyed the very foundation of Tom's family. As the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, Tom's initial disbelief turned into a simmering anger. What had started as small doubts had now grown into undeniable truth, and the rage he felt was something he had never anticipated. He knew he couldn't ignore this any longer. Something had to be done, but Tom wasn't sure what. The anger bubbling inside him felt like a beast that couldn't be contained, but even as the betrayal consumed him, he realized that the next steps were crucial. Confronting Rachel would be inevitable, but confronting Richard, his father, was another matter altogether. The line between family loyalty and the desire for justice was becoming dangerously blurred, and Tom couldn't yet see the full extent of how far he would go to reclaim the life that had been taken from him. The truth was out, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The weight of Tom's discovery hung heavily on him, each passing day making it harder to ignore. He had spent hours replaying the messages on Rachel's phone in his mind, analyzing each word, each interaction, and each subtle hint that suggested an affair. The pain of betrayal was suffocating, but what was worse was the confusion. How had he missed it all? How had Richard, his own father, become the architect of his misery? The questions burned at him, and the anger festered like an open wound. For days, Tom struggled with how to confront the two people who had broken his trust. He knew he had to face Rachel first, but the idea of confronting his wife, the woman he had loved for so long, was a challenge he wasn't prepared for. What would he say? How could he begin to untangle the web of lies that had been spun right under his nose? The more he thought about it, the more it felt like the entire foundation of his life was collapsing. Eventually, he could take it no longer. The weight of the secret was unbearable, and the simmering anger inside him pushed him to act. One evening, after their children had gone to bed, Tom decided to confront Rachel. He waited for her in their bedroom, pacing back and forth, his heart racing in his chest. When she entered, looking tired but still beautiful as always, she didn't immediately notice the tension in the air. Tom stood still, his expression hardening as he looked at her. His voice, when it finally came, was low and measured. He wasn't sure what to expect, but the words came out sharper than he intended. "I know, Rachel. I know about you and my father." Rachel froze, her face draining of color. She didn't speak immediately, her eyes darting toward the door as though contemplating, escape. But there was no way out now. Tom could see the guilt written all over her face, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her own shame. The silence between them stretched out for what felt like an eternity before she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen." Tom's stomach turned at her words. It wasn't the apology he had hoped for, but rather a feeble attempt to justify the unjustifiable. He felt the anger rise in him again, this time more explosive than before. The floodgates of emotion opened and he couldn't control it any longer. "You never meant for it to happen? You slept with my father, Rachel. This isn't just a mistake. This is betrayal." Rachel began to cry, but her tears did nothing to ease Tom's fury. How could she cry now, after everything she had done? How could she feel remorse when she had stolen something from him so precious? His heart was breaking, but his anger was too overwhelming to allow for any sympathy. "I was lonely, Tom. You were always so busy. I didn't know how to deal with it anymore. Richard was there for me when you weren't, Rachel said, through her tears. Her words made Tom's blood run cold. My father. You went to him? The thought of Richard, the man who had been his guide and mentor for so many years, now standing as the one who had betrayed him in the worst possible way, was a bitter pill to swallow. Tom couldn't bear to look at her anymore. He turned away, his head swimming with a mix of anger and heartbreak. His entire life had been built on trust, and now it had been shattered by the two people he trusted the most. But there was still one more confrontation that Tom knew he couldn't avoid. Richard. He had to face the man who had caused this destruction, the man who had, in his twisted way, betrayed his own son. Tom didn't know what he would say to him, or what would happen when the truth was laid bare between them. But one thing was certain. This would not be a conversation easily forgotten. That night, as Tom lay in bed, his mind raced with possibilities. He didn't know where this would all end, but the next steps were clear. He had to confront Richard face to face and ask the questions that had haunted him for days. Why? Why had Richard done this? What had he hoped to gain from it? The answers seemed as elusive as ever. But Tom knew that the only way to move forward, even if that meant falling further into darkness, was to face the man who had destroyed his life. The weight of the coming confrontation felt unbearable, but Tom had no choice but to follow the path he had started down. He was no longer the same man he had been just a week ago. He had changed, and the road ahead would be one of pain and consequences. The night after Tom confronted Rachel, he found himself alone with his thoughts. The bitter sting of betrayal still fresh and raw. The conversation with his wife had been devastating, but it was only the beginning. He had seen Rachel's tears, heard her apologies, but it wasn't enough to erase the damage that had been done. A marriage built on years of trust and love had been shattered in an instant. And now Tom had to face the one person who had caused it all. Richard, his father. Tom's mind raced with questions. What was his father thinking? How could someone he had looked up to, admired and respected for so many years become the very person who would destroy his family? Richard had always been a pillar of strength in Tom's life, a man who had shown him the ropes of business, who had taught him how to be a good father, a good husband. But now, Richard was nothing more than the architect of his misery. The thought of confronting Richard filled Tom with a mixture of dread and anger. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish. Would he find some justification for the affair? Would Richard admit to his wrongs? Or would it all end in further denial, leaving Tom with even more questions than answers? There was no way to know, but Tom knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. The following day, Tom invited Richard over for what seemed like a normal family gathering. Tom had carefully planned every detail, trying to keep his emotions in check. When Richard arrived, everything appeared as it always had, cordial, calm, almost businesslike. The two exchanged pleasantries as if nothing was amiss. Richard didn't sense the tension in Tom's voice, the undercurrent of anger that had been building since the night before. Tom led his father into the living room, offering him a drink as he normally would. The house was quiet, the children away at school, and Rachel in another part of the house trying to process the events that had unfolded. Tom took a deep breath, steadying himself for what was about to come. "Dad, we need to talk," Tom said, his voice betraying a coldness that felt unfamiliar to him. Richard looked up, his face unreadable. "Of course, son," Richard replied, casually, as if nothing had changed between them. He took a sip of his drink, unaware that this conversation would be unlike any other they had ever had. Tom took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides, and said, I know what you've been doing. I know about the affair with Rachel. Richard's expression didn't change at first. His eyes narrowed slightly, but there was no sign of surprise or guilt. Instead, he set his glass down on the table and leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. Tom, I don't know what you're talking about, Richard said, his voice calm, almost dismissive. He spoke as though Tom had misunderstood, as though the situation could still be explained away. The denial only made Tom's anger grow stronger. Don't lie to me, Dad. I've seen the messages. I know everything. You've been sleeping with my wife. Richard let out a slow sigh, as if he were tiring of the conversation already. Tom, I never wanted you to find out this way. But Rachel, she's been in pain for years. She needed someone to listen to her, to understand her. I was there for her when you weren't. Tom's chest tightened at his father's words. But he wasn't done. You think that justifies it? You think you can steal my wife from me because she was lonely? You're my father. How could you betray me like this? How could you do this to our family? Richard's face softened, but there was no apology in his eyes, only a strange, almost pitying look. You don't understand, Tom. You've always been so focused on your business. You didn't see what was happening in your marriage. I stepped in because I saw what you couldn't. Rachel needed someone who could give her the attention she deserved, and I gave her that. The coldness in Tom's chest deepened. He had never heard his father speak like this before, and the realization that Richard had been so coldly calculating made his skin crawl. Richard's words were twisted, as though he truly believed what he had done was justified. There was no remorse in his voice, no recognition of the damage he had caused. Is that how you justify it? By blaming me? Tom's voice broke with emotion, but the anger still burned. I trusted you, Dad. You were supposed to be the one I could rely on, the one who would always have my back. Richard stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Tom with a mixture of sadness and something darker, resentment perhaps. I did what I had to do, Tom, and you need to understand that. It's not about you, it's about Rachel and me. What we shared was something real. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he processed his father's words. His entire life, his family, had been turned upside down by this twisted affair. He could barely process the pain, let alone the deeper betrayal, the way his father had justified his actions. In that moment, Tom realized that the man he had once revered was not the father he had thought him to be. The damage had been done, and nothing could fix it now. The confrontation, though painful, had confirmed everything Tom had feared. Richard wasn't the man he had believed him to be, and now the path forward seemed inevitable. Tom knew that the future of his family was forever changed, and the consequences of this day would be felt for the rest of their lives. The confrontation with Richard had left Tom feeling more hollow than he had ever imagined possible. The man, who had always been a pillar of strength in his life, someone he had looked up to, was now nothing more than the source of his torment. Richard had offered no real apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, and no remorse for his actions. His words had been cold, detached, as if he believed his betrayal was justified, even necessary. Tom, however, had heard enough. The finality of the moment settled in like a heavy weight on his chest, crushing the last remnants of trust he had left in his father. Tom spent the following days in a state of numbness. The house, once filled with the sounds of family life, felt eerily silent. Rachel had become a stranger to him, a woman who had torn apart everything he held dear. She was apologetic, yes, but the sincerity in her voice was hard to discern. Was she truly sorry for what had happened, or was she simply regretful that she had been caught? Tom wasn't sure anymore. The woman he had shared his life with seemed like a ghost, someone he no longer recognized. The love they had shared now felt like a distant memory, a lie woven from years of deceit. Rachel tried to reach out to him, her attempts at reconciliation falling flat as Tom grew increasingly distant. Their children, sensing the tension in the air, had become quieter, more withdrawn. The once vibrant household was now shadowed by the cracks in Tom and Rachel's relationship, the weight of betrayal hanging over them like a dark cloud. Tom knew something had to be done. He couldn't continue living in this suffocating silence, pretending that everything was normal. He needed to make a decision, and that decision would shape the rest of his life. The first thing Tom did was hire a lawyer. The idea of divorce had been something he had tried to avoid, but as the days dragged on, it became clear that there was no coming back from this. He couldn't forgive Rachel, and he certainly couldn't continue living under the same roof as Richard. The relationship between father and son had been irrevocably damaged, and there was no healing that wound. Tom needed to take control of his life, to remove the toxic influences that had infected it, no matter how difficult the road ahead would be. The lawyer advised Tom to be cautious, to consider the children and the future that awaited them. Divorce, especially one that involved such deep betrayal, would be messy and painful. But Tom wasn't concerned with that anymore. His priorities had shifted. The anger that had consumed him in the days following his discovery of the affair had given way to a quiet, cold resolve. He wasn't going to let Rachel or Richard dictate his future. He wasn't going to let their actions control him any longer. Tom spent the next few weeks preparing for the inevitable. He moved out of the family home, finding a small apartment in the city, away from the life he had known. The children, though, initially confused by the changes, began to adjust. Tom made sure to be there for them, to show them that even though their family was no longer whole, they could still have a future filled with love and stability. The divorce papers were filed, and the legal process began. Throughout this time, Rachel reached out repeatedly, begging for a chance to fix things. She sent texts, left voicemails, and even showed up at Tom's apartment, desperate for reconciliation. But Tom's resolve remained firm. He couldn't look at her without remembering the betrayal. He couldn't pretend that the love they once shared could be resurrected after everything that had happened. Rachel had made her choice, and now Tom had to make his. As the divorce proceedings dragged on, Tom began to focus on rebuilding his life. The pain of the betrayal still lingered, but he knew that healing would take time. He leaned on friends and family who had stood by him throughout this dark period, finding solace in the support of those who still cared for him. He threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from the whirlwind of emotions he had been grappling with. Slowly but surely, the pieces of his life began to fall into place.